Righty, we are live. Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Ian Morris with his new book, Geography is Destiny, Britain's Place in the World, a 10,000-year history. Ian Morris is the Jean and Rebecca Willard Professor of Classics and Professor of History at Stanford University and the author of the critically acclaimed Why the West Rules for Now, as well as The Measure of Civilization, How Social Development Decides the Fate of Nations, Foragers, Farmers, and Fossil Fuels, How Human Values Evolve, and War, What is it good for? And he argues the answer is not absolutely nothing. He's published many scholarly books and has directed excavations in Greece and Italy. And today we will be discussing actually all these books, as well as, of course, a deep dive into his new Geography is Destiny book. Ian Morris, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on, and nice to see you again. I haven't seen you since 2015 when you came to Caltech for me for our conference on the future.
That's right. It's a long time ago. Good to see you too.
Yeah, lots of changes have happened there, and you gave a lecture on human values and how they're largely shaped by geography and lifestyle choice and industry versus agriculture, and what forms of energy capture you use. I thought I'd start before we get into your book, just a little bit of background on you. You know, you're one of these big picture, big history archaeologists and scholars and historians. What's your story, man? How'd you get into all that? Where are you from, and why did you take that path?
Well, I started off, I grew up in the English Midlands in a very sort of post-industrial landscape, and I was always very interested in history in the past. When I was a little kid, I wanted to be a paleontologist, like dinosaurs were the big thing. And then I wanted to be an astronaut. And then I wanted to be a professional footballer. And these were all like disastrous career choices. But luckily I settled down a little bit. I wanted to be a rock musician for a long time too. Bad choices. Settled down though on archaeology. And originally, I worked on ancient Greece, and I was very interested in the rise of Greek city-states in the first millennium BC. And they create these really weird cities organized around the idea that all the free men in the city are roughly equal. It doesn't matter how rich you are. All the free men are roughly equal, but they have lots of slaves, and women have almost no political, economic rights whatsoever. And I worked on these topics for a long time. But one thing that I learned quite early on as a graduate student was that if I started enlarging the kind of geographical and chronological frameworks that I was looking at, new answers would pop up. So I was looking particularly at the city of Athens, but I found, well, hey, if I look at a longer period, I begin to see the questions in new ways. And if I look at a larger space of broadening out to the whole of Greece and the whole of the Mediterranean, new answers keep popping up. And so this just kind of went on, and I moved from digging in Greece to digging in Sicily. And eventually I start thinking, well, to understand what's going on in ancient Greece, you've really got to look at the whole of the ancient old world, from the Mediterranean out to China. And then one day it dawns on me that I'm no longer really looking at these big scales to get new answers to the little questions about a local place. Now I am finding that the big questions about the big scales, those are what really interest me. And so I quite abruptly, about a dozen years ago, made this switch over to looking at the long term, the large scale. This is the questions that really began to interest me. Why is the world the way that it is? And can studying the past give us some sense of what might happen next? And once I started down this path, I kind of found it impossible to go back again. So I've stuck with it ever since.
Interesting. Yeah, well, big history was popular like in the late 19th, early 20th century, right? With H.G. Wells and Oswald Spengler and you know, all those guys, and the Will and Ariel Durant series that everybody had to have a copy of in their living room, even if they never read it, because it kind of gave you the impression of being a scholarly, worldly person. And then that kind of went out of favor, right, until maybe the late 90s or so. What's the difference between the kind of stuff you guys do now, doing big history, versus what was done in a century ago?
Yeah, I think that the history of big history is really interesting in itself. And it's kind of come and gone in these cycles. And you can actually go quite a lot further back than even the late 19th century, because it really takes off in the early 18th century with the sort of Enlightenment thinkers. They're looking at the history of the world and when they, in the early 18th century, most people in Europe are looking at world history very much in a Christian kind of lens and saying, if you want to understand the world, you need to focus on the Bible, focus on the Roman Empire where Christianity got spread. And that will give you all the answers. And these Enlightenment guys are saying, well, yes, but all this new information is coming in from places like India, China, the Americas, Africa, just doesn't fit very well in this biblical framework. So maybe the way to explain world history is by looking at all the societies we see existing out there at the moment and arranging them in a kind of typological order. So say, what if the world actually, when the world got going, everybody had been a hunter-gatherer? And then they progress from there to being pastoralists, and from there to being farmers, and from there to being civilized commercial people like we are in Paris or Edinburgh or wherever you happen to be. And maybe that's actually the way to understand the world. This becomes hugely popular, and then people start pointing out at the end of the 18th century, you guys, you don't actually know anything. You're making up all these stories. It's not calling it conjectural history. You make up all these stories. You don't actually know anything. And so what we really need to do is concentrate much harder on the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, and that will really explain everything. And this becomes very dominant for a while. Then mid-19th century, of course, you've got Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer on the sociological side. Whole new set of theories about global scale evolutionary development of societies. Early 20th century, they kind of go out of fashion as well. Similar sort of reason, you guys don't know anything. Mid 20th century, they come back into fashion again with archaeologists. And by this point, the archaeologists, by the 1950s, these guys really do know a lot of stuff by that point about foraging societies and early farming societies. And when it goes out of fashion again in the late 20th century, it's much more on theoretical grounds. It's wicked to kind of reduce all people in the world to this unilineal evolutionary framework, and you are slighting the agency of real people by saying it's all driven by materialist factors. And so that drops out again, comes back again at the very end of the 20th century, when you get people like, Jared Diamond, I think, is very much the pioneer in the new version of this, saying, well, we understand evolution now, biological evolution, in such a more sophisticated way than we used to do. And when we apply the new ways people are thinking about evolution, the whole story just begins to make a lot more sense again. So I think you look 250 years, we had this back and forth between the generalizing and the particularistic views of world history. And so I don't think anyone is going to win this argument, basically. I think this is just going to keep going and going into the future.
Interesting. Yeah. So much of political philosophy starts with Hobbes and Rousseau, both of whom speculated on what humans were like in a state of nature. But in fact, neither one of them had any idea what humans were like in a state of nature. They were just talking through their ass.
Yes.
This is the way it was. And it's so much of our political science starts with that. And it's like, maybe we ought to double check with archaeologists who actually know something about these, or anthropologists who study hunter-gatherer groups. And so, of course, we now reject any kind of Marxian forces of history that push things along inevitably. There's no such thing. But on the other hand, isn't there kind of a logic? They take Jared Diamond's argument that, to go from a small band of a couple dozen people where conflict resolution can happen on a small scale. You just sit around a circle in the common grounds and talk about your problems and make right what was wrong and so on. But if you scale up to thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, you end up in this kind of hierarchical structure rather than a horizontal structure where you have to have somebody at the top that enforces the laws, and you need a bureaucracy and so on. And I just had this pot. Hang on one second. This guy. I just had this guy. You probably know this book, The Dawn of Everything.
Yes.
I had David. So I had him on the show, and he says, "Oh, that's all bullshit. Jared's wrong about that. There's clear archaeological evidence that there were multiple experiments. Some were horizontal, some were vertical, some were mixed." And some were more patriarchal, some were more matriarchal, and there's many ways to solve human conflict problems, and you don't have to have a hierarchy. I don't know if you've read that book or what your thoughts are on kind of trying to overturn that argument.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book. I mean, I do strongly recommend everybody interested in these questions should read The Dawn of Everything. I disagree with it on pretty much everything, but it's a really interesting book, and I'm very glad that I read it. And I think what they managed to do in that book is they took all these bits of information that, on the whole, the evolutionists we were all aware of the things they were talking about, like the very rich Ice Age burials that you get in Europe, or societies like the Shoshone and the Cheyenne, who do seem to cycle through. In one part of the year, they're very hierarchical, and other parts of the year, they're very dispersed over the landscape, very low hierarchy. And it's a bunch of other stuff they talk about as well. And people were aware of this stuff, but I think what we've been doing was like, the philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, wrote this really famous book 60 years ago, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he said that the common sense idea of how science works is that, you're a scientist, you go in your lab, you tinker around, you run some experiment, you learn something. That gets bolted onto what we already know, and gradually, incrementally, scientific knowledge grows. Well, says Thomas Kuhn, that's not how it worked at all. You look at somebody like Copernicus, he doesn't tinker with what's already out there, the Ptolemaic views of the Earth-centered universe. He just blows the whole thing out of the water. And what actually happens in scientific revolutions is that in the course of doing normal science, all these results come up which kind of don't quite fit with whatever the dominant view at the time is. And scientists sort of just put them to one side and say, we'll worry about that later. We'll come back to that one. And you just ignore it and you get on with doing your job. Now, at a certain point, the anomalies have piled up so much that you can get a guy like Copernicus or the two Davids, David Graeber and David Wengrow, will come along and say, hey, wait a minute, look at this mountain of anomalies. This doesn't sort of mess with the edges of the dominant theory. This completely sinks the dominant theory. So the two Davids put all the anomalies together and said, hey, put them together and look. The evolutionary kind of theories that Jared Diamond was talking about, this just does not explain what we see in the factual record. And they were right to point to all this stuff. And I mean, like a lot of people, I had sort of, put this stuff to one side and not worried about it. Seeing it all heaped up in one place in their book really made me spend quite a bit of the last year thinking more seriously about these anomalies. And I now feel that they are not really a challenge to the standard evolutionary narrative. It's just that, like, if Jared Diamond were writing Guns, Germs and Steel now, as opposed to 25 years ago when he did, he would write it differently. The basic storyline would be more or less the same. But you do have to face up to these anomalies and explain why they're there and how they fit into the larger picture. So, I think The Dawn of Everything does this really good job of shaking up the profession and making us think a little bit harder about what we're doing. The claim that it makes that it has sunk all the stories we've been telling for the last 250 years, I think that is just completely wrong. But that kind of doesn't detract from the value of the book.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder if there's some physics envy here where we want laws of human nature and society to be like those in physics, where there's just no exceptions, or there's just a few exceptions, like the Mercury orbit can only be explained with Einstein's relativity. Other than that, Newtonian mechanics works pretty good, and so on. And it's never going to be like that for human behavior in societies. There's always going to be some exception. So what you're talking about here is kind of a generalization that applies to most people in most places. Yes, it's possible you could have 1,000 people or 10,000 people, and you don't have to have this hierarchical structure. Maybe they managed to solve this in this one area here or there, but the overall anomalies don't add up to a paradigm shift. That's what you're arguing, right?
Yeah, and I think because this is one of the beauties of evolutionary theory, that you can talk about human beings being a certain way and rabbits being a certain way. It doesn't mean that every single human being is exactly the same. I mean, there's a general trend, a sort of evolutionarily stable strategy, and if you're going to succeed genetically, you are going to want to hew fairly closely to the evolutionarily stable strategy for your species in the particular environmental niche that you're in. But that doesn't mean you can't do whatever the heck you want. It's just that you'll pay a price if you behave too strangely. I mean, humans have evolved to solve our problems in certain ways. If you abruptly decide you're going to act completely differently from everybody else, you're probably going to pay a price for that. Doesn't mean evolution is wrong. Just means that it's a certain kind of theory, and yet we're never going to be physicists. Sadly, we're never going to do that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a couple other questions based on your previous books before we dive into the new one. So in Why the West Rules, for now, you hung that little dash there, for now. So that, we've had almost a decade since that, more than a decade, I guess, since that book's been out. What are your thoughts on the United States, UK, Europe, and the West in the context of the rise of China and Russia's, recent revanchism and so on?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question to ask. I mean, for anybody who writes a book that has implications about where things might be going next, you're inevitably you're constantly reflecting on, oh, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? And I guess in that book, that was where I started developing, thinking about what history might tell us about the future. And the sort of general conclusion I came to there was that history's not a very good guide to the future, but of course it's the only one we've got. So we have to do the best we can with what's already happened in the past. And generally, it seemed to me that when you're talking about processes operating at the biggest possible scale and the highest level of generality, you can start to formulate theories based on what happened in the past that generally seem to work out quite well. But the more you get down into the nitty gritty, the less well they work. And basically, the more you get down to the nitty gritty, day by day kind of history, the more that individual human agency and personal quirks and decisions begin to matter. And so, I mean, I feel that's sort of been more or less borne out in the 12 years now since Why the West Rules for Now came out. That I made two, I guess not exactly predictions, but laid out sort of two broad directions that things might go, with the reality probably lying somewhere in between. And one side was the rather depressing version of the future, where basically the world has, the long-term story has been that the world has been congealing into larger and larger units and forms of organization over time, increasing in scale and complexity. The amount of energy that humans are able to extract and process have been increasing. Our efficiency of using the energy going up, our stock of knowledge going up and up and up. And this is, at least for people with my sort of sensibilities, this is a very upbeat, happy view of the world. And if this carries on, all kinds of things might happen, but we should expect the 21st century to see more change in the human condition, the coming 100 years to see more change in the human condition than the previous 100,000 years, which sounds sort of lunatic, except that in a lot of ways, the last 100 years had already seen more change than the previous 100,000. And the world we live in now, it's just so wildly different from the world our great-great-grandparents grew up in. But I think the world that our descendants in 100 years are going to live in is going to be, it's going to be like more different from our world than our world is different from the Neanderthal world. We're approaching one of these profound evolutionary ruptures. We're going to change what it means to be a human being. And there's all kinds of possible ways that might pan out. And I talk about them a little bit in the book. We don't really know what's going to happen, of course. But one option is that we go through this sort of singularity type moment, that we transform what it is to be human beings. The other end of the spectrum, though, is a little bit less happy. The big thing happening during our lifetimes. I mean, I'd always thought that the big thing that happened during my lifetime is the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Warsaw Pact. I think that has now already been overshadowed by the rise of China and the shift in wealth and power from the Western world toward the East. And these sorts of big shifts have happened many times in the past. But the depressing thing about them is that every major shift in wealth and power in the history of the world so far has been accompanied by massive amounts of violence. This has just been the uniform law. If that happens again as wealth and power shift from west to east in the 21st century, we're now doing it in a world where we've got nuclear weapons. And because the good news is we now only have about 1/10 the number of nuclear weapons we had in the 1980s, when we probably could have ended all life on Earth in a couple of days. Now I don't think we can do that. But we are building once again. The number is starting to go back up again. This is a truly terrifying prospect. If we rerun the way we have handled these changes in the past, we're likely to destroy the human race altogether. Now, again, I think there is a sort of middle course here, there's something of a silver lining. That, I mean, if you look at the way conflicts have been resolved, since 1945, since the advent of nuclear weapons, we have moved into a different phase. Whether it's different enough that we can actually head off Armageddon, that still remains to be seen. But I think there is still grounds to be fairly optimistic about how things might turn out. But the sort of shorter term predictions I made in my book, well, I did not foresee the rise of ISIS and all of the stuff that happened in the 2010s in the Middle East. But then, who did? So I don't feel too bad about that. A lot of things I didn't foresee. Did not foresee the rise of Donald Trump. Again, who did? But that sort of thing, that actually should have been a bit more predictable. This sense of the growing alienation between a cosmopolitan elite that was sort of fully taking advantage of the newly globalized world and a large group of people feeling they're being left behind. That was already becoming visible in the late 2000s. And I felt I should have done a better job of seeing that sort of thing coming. The shift in wealth and power from west to east, the only part of that I think I got wrong was I didn't realize how quickly this was going to move. One of the lines I used in that book was that we should expect the United States to remain the world's globocop for the coming generation, possibly for the next 2 generations, probably not for the next 3 generations. Now, I think it's not entirely clear that even the coming generation, an American global order, is going to survive. So I think I did, by the standards of predictors, I think I did quite well. But we don't know how it's going to turn out.
Yeah. Yeah, at the end of the moral arc, I speculated about becoming a new species. Once we start living on Mars, say, then we have a founder population. And we may get a bottleneck in which, even if we don't exterminate life on Earth and it continues on here, whatever they're going to become in the next 10,000 or 100,000 years as we migrate out to other planets and moons around Jupiter and Saturn and so forth, if this is even possible. Or if we migrate out in the next 500,000 years to other solar systems, then we would have a new species entirely. I think it's more likely what you hinted at there is something like AI coming on board here to the point of the singularity, and we become a different species than we were. Just just how things will change here. But that's hard to say. At the moment, that's mostly all science fiction, I think. Ray Kurzweil keeps pushing back the date of the singularity, right, to later and later.
Yes.
Still maybe within our lifetime, but who knows? Yeah. Okay, so in your book, War, What Is It Good For? You point out that, if we lived as hunter-gatherers, it'd be about a 20% chance of dying violently as farmers, maybe a 10% chance as industrialists, maybe a 1% chance or less in the modern world. And so do you see Ukraine, the war in Ukraine and Putin as an anomaly now? This is just the availability heuristic. If you just watch the news, it seems like here we go again. Humanity can't get its shit straight. We're back to war again. And it's the battle days all over again. Or that's one possibility. Or this really is an anomaly and he has pretty much the whole world against him because of the change in norms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think we're going to find out fairly quickly, one way or another. And I think this is the sort of thing where the big history, long-term perspective isn't very good at telling you whether a particular case is the start of a wild swing away from the trend line, or whether it is just a sort of little blip on the screen. And I say, if you think about World War One. We tend to think of World War One now as this completely pointless war, absolutely catastrophic thing, disastrous anomaly, swinging away from the 19th century trend line, which after Waterloo, after 1815, have been very much down and down with the number of international wars and the likelihood of people dying violently, particularly in Europe and North America. And World War One comes along, and of course, there's this massive slaughter. 10, 15 million people die at least, depending on how you count. And during the 1920s, Europeans come to look back on the war as just being this tragic mistake that was made and a horrible anomaly. Looking back from the end of the 20th century, though, World War One seems to start making more sense as part of a 75-year-long struggle to dominate the world. Going into World War One, you've still got a British-dominated global order that has been very successful at managing the use of violence, driving it down and down, particularly successful for the British, but pretty successful for a lot of other people as well. And by 1989, 75 years later, that order has been completely swept away. Two German challenges to it have been defeated, and you've now got an American-dominated global order that, at least for 20, 25 years, was even more successful at driving down rates of violent death, increasing global trade, increasing the openness of the world. And so I think perspective is really important on deciding where a conflict fits in. Because like with Ukraine, one way to look at it is to say, well, what we've got here is a situation not so very different from what Adolf Hitler confronted in the 1930s. And I know there's a lot of other facile analogies get made between Putin and Hitler, but I think with this one, Hitler comes along in the early 30s, comes to power in Germany, and Hitler's whole thing is about the use of force, the power of the state to solve all its problems by selective application of force and violence. And he looks around Europe and he sees governments, particularly in the West, that have been so traumatized by World War I that there's almost nothing that he can do that will drive the French and British to say, well, damn it, we're going to go to war with you now. And of course, Munich in 1938 absolutely confirms him in this view. It's like you've got this sort of game being played, a rational choice kind of game, where actors have found after World War I that by being very, very peaceful, pacific, you generally get the better payoffs. And that opens this little space where if you react to every problem with extreme violence, at least for a while, you will get away with this. You will win the confrontations. And Hitler, he's actually quite astute. He does understand what's going on. He knows you can't get away with this forever, that sooner or later everybody's going to say, wait a minute. And they're going to come down on you with the entire weight of the Western economies and destroy Germany completely. But he gambles that there's enough of a gap here for me to get in there, defeat the Western powers, turn on the Soviets, defeat them, and make Germany this great world power by clever, rapid use of violence. And of course, it turns out he is catastrophically wrong. And it's easy to see how the world might have looked like that to Vladimir Putin up till February of this year. That I was one of the people who thought that Putin had handled geopolitics really well over the previous decade or so. Yeah, I think he ran rings around the Western powers in Syria. He certainly made us look like monkeys over his first engagement with Ukraine back in the early 2010s. But I think he made this disastrous miscalculation in launching this large-scale invasion of Ukraine, that the Russian army just couldn't sustain this. But whether this is a one-off thing and the effect, assuming that Putin does ultimately get defeated, whether the effect of that will be to either accelerate the downward trend in the use of interstate violence, that's perfectly possible. Or it could turn out that this is, in fact, the beginning of a new phase where force gets used more and more as the people's confidence in the ability of the United States to police a global order goes down. They become more ready to use force. And I think that what will be the deciding factor there is going to be what happens with Russia and China in the wake of this war. Like, one of the big fears has been that defeating Putin in Ukraine will make him lean more toward China. China and Russia will form a single geopolitical bloc dominating Eurasia. Many of the grand strategic nightmares of the Western world of the last 100 years will begin to come true at that point, and this is going to be a disaster. But some strategists say, well, if Putin fails badly enough in Ukraine, Putin becomes toxic. Xi Jinping is trying to go for an unprecedented extra term running China. The last thing he needs is to be associated with this absolute loser who is dragging him into all kinds of problems, probably. He won't want it to become one of these classic situations where like the tail wags the dog and China, the great power. Well, actually, the way I sometimes think about it is like, Germany gets dragged into World War I because of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the whole thing over Serbia and the Archduke getting shot and so on. And German officers would regularly refer to their country as being shackled to a corpse, that the dead weight of Austria was dragging Germany down to defeat. And it's, I think, distinctly possible Xi Jinping will look at Russia as being a corpse that they might become shackled to. So again, I think when you get down to that level of detail, big history is not very helpful. I think big history is useful in clarifying that we're at one of these turning points right now. All kinds of possibilities are going to be put on the table and played out over the next 10 years or so. It doesn't always tell you the actual decisions people are going to make and how the particulars will turn out in the short run.
Do you think if Putin would have just grabbed the Donbass region and then pulled out instead of this full-on invasion, we would have done what we did when he grabbed Crimea and just said, well, that was really, really bad, and we were really unhappy about that, but we'll see you at the G20 next year. at this point,
Yeah,
how does he ever show up again? Whatever happens,
I
how does he show up and talk to anybody?
Yeah, I must say, when this whole thing got going, I thought that was what he was going to do. I was like a lot of people, completely astonished. Was it February the 24th? Was it when it becomes clear? Oh, this is not getting things going in eastern Ukraine. This is the whole. He's trying to swallow the whole thing here, and I did think that was a disastrous mistake on his part, simply because he wasn't doing what I would have done if I'd been the dictator. And I think he made a terrible mistake there. I think if he had just sort of upscaled what was going on with the insurgency, he would have got away with it. I think we would have been harder on him than we were in 2014, but not a lot harder. So yeah, I think this was a disastrous miscalculation, and because what a lot of the strategists in the US are now saying is that he probably didn't know what his army was not capable of. That there's no incentive, if you're a Russian general, there's no incentive to tell anybody above you the truth ever. So he probably knew less about the Russian army than the CIA knows.
Right. Have you seen this viral video that went out yesterday? Let's see, we're recording this on May 11th, so May 10th, of David Attenborough narrating what happens to the migratory Russian tanks. Like the Pacific salmon, they migrate from the hinterlands of Russia, and they all die when they get to the fields of Ukraine. And then they blow their top off as the final swan song of their lives. It's really funny. Yeah, that's right. That's part of the problem of being a dictator, is that you're surrounded by yes men who won't tell you reality, right? So, but this brings up and gets us into your new book of what does it mean to be Russian or Ukrainian? I mean, why are the Ukrainians now Ukrainian and not Russian? They were Russian for all those decades before. And in the context of your new book, you talk about these 5 different characteristics that Nigel Farage brought up with Brexit. Identity, that is, who the British thought they were. Mobility, who was moving into and out of and around the British Isles. Prosperity, how rich the islanders were and how the riches were shared. Security, how safe they were from violence. And sovereignty, who makes the rules. So how do you think about we can get into Britain in a moment, but who are Ukrainians? Why are they all of a sudden their own nation state and they're different from the Russians in the context of those 5 features?
Yeah, one of the big patterns you see when you look at long-term history is the way identities, when you look at it over the long term, identities are fairly constantly shifting. That all the great empires of the past, like say the Han Dynasty in China 2,000 years ago, or the Romans in the Mediterranean basin 2,000 years ago, they take over these big areas that are full of people who consider themselves to be very, very different from each other. So, Romans conquer Western Europe. They take over Gaul, but Gaul is full of all these different tribal groups who are fiercely independent, very strong identities sometimes. But over the course of several centuries, these Gallic tribes start to think of themselves as Roman. So that by the point you get the Germanic invasions at the end of the Roman Empire, it's very much the Roman Empire they're coming into, not a bunch of separate places like Gaul and Spain and so on. And so these changes do happen over the long run. And say, a place like Britain itself, English, Welsh, Scottish and Irish still have rather distinct identities. But 2,000 years ago, there were far more separate identities, very, very deeply entrenched. Now, the Ukrainians, up till the 18th century, Ukraine was not part of Russia. It gets taken over largely by Catherine the Great and absorbed into Russia. Through the 19th century, it's always viewed with a lot of suspicion by the Tsars. The Ukrainian identity is still felt to be very strong. Ukraine breaks away from Russia at the very end of the First World War. The Germans set up a puppet regime there that's independent. Then it gets taken back into the Soviet Union during the Russian Civil War. And it then gets separated again, of course, in 1991. So the periods when Ukraine was part of Russia or the Soviet Union, again, to the big history guy like me, I'm used to dealing in millennia here, these are pretty short periods. We shouldn't be surprised that Ukrainian identity is still very strong. And, Stalin in the 1920s and 1930s, when Stalin's presiding over the Soviet Union, he deliberately allowed famine to spiral out of control in Ukraine, partly because it was part of his collectivization of agriculture program, but partly because he just wanted to see a lot of Ukrainians dead. If a few million Ukrainians starve, that's good, because you can't trust those people. In spite of obviously being a Marxist, Stalin was still very wedded to the ideas about ethnic identity, and that you just can't trust certain kinds of people. And Ukrainians and Poles, he thought, particularly untrustworthy people. If millions starve, that's good. So we shouldn't be wildly surprised that the Ukrainians took very, very negatively to being invaded by the Russians. Just as we should not be wildly surprised. Like if Putin had succeeded in this invasion of Ukraine, I'm pretty certain the Baltic states would have been next very, very soon. The Russians would have moved into the Baltic states, and if that had happened, it would have been no surprise at all if the Lithuanians and Estonians and Latvians had fought every bit as bitterly as the Ukrainians. Because it's like the Russians are the ancestral enemy to the Ukrainians, even more than the Germans or the Poles. The Russians are the bad guys. So we should not be very surprised, I think, at seeing this level of determination to resist the Russians. I would say the only surprising thing here was just how good at it they were. Because you look at all the corruption indices. We all talk about, well, the Russians couldn't possibly succeed because they're so corrupt. Well, Ukraine is only marginally less corrupt than Russia. This is not an EU kind of country, which is why, because the EU has been so keeping a distance from them. I mean, I think that what surprised me is just how efficient and effective they've been at it.
Yeah, I've had guests say that they should have just said to Putin, okay, we'll keep Ukraine out of NATO for the next 25 years. And that would have satisfied him. Putin would have been 95 by the time they could have joined, because NATO wasn't going to take them anyway because they were too corrupt. So why not just give him that? Well,
yes,
that's past now. But this brings up this, what are the features that go into a nation state or a culture or a people? We think of language, clothes, food, values, the kind of things that you hold dear, your deepest moral convictions, religion. Mm-hmm. And so on. How do you think about that for the British? Because that's subject to your new book. That break they had, 8,000 years ago or whatever, when the sea levels rose and the English Channel became real. That's kind of a founding population in an evolutionary scale. But just not only Britain, mm-hmm. but for anybody. I mean, who are Americans? Is there an American character that involves not just language but food and culture and ideas and so forth? And would you apply that to Ukrainians and Russians and Britain and Europe? And what does it mean to be German versus French? How do you think about that?
Yeah, because pretty much everybody in the world today lives in a nation state. And so we very much take this for granted as the way societies are organized. But historically, the nation state is kind of a weird concept. You've really got almost nothing you could call a nation state before, say, the late 18th century. And that's the point when reorganizing countries, particularly in Europe, is where it gets started. Reorganizing countries on a new basis suddenly starts to be a very effective way to do things. And the new basis that they come up with is saying, okay, there's this place called France. It's been around for a while now. But what we're going to say is new about it is that France is a country where French people live, which again, to us doesn't sound so radical. But France is a country where French people live. Everybody in France is French. If you're not French, get the heck out of here or become French in a hurry. And being French means you descend from a common group of ancestors. I mean, even though at this point, of course, they have no real idea about genetics or anything, it is sort of a genetic argument. We descend from a shared group of ancestors, and often we know that these ancestors are kind of fictitious. They've been made up, but it doesn't matter. You've got to commit to the idea of descending from a shared group of ancestors, and the way this gets expressed, this genetic baseline gets expressed culturally, is shared language is one of the big things. You must speak French. You must learn French. If you are a Spanish speaker or a Basque speaker, of whom there were plenty in southern France at that time, you just got to learn French in a hurry and become French. You're going to go through a French educational system. So a national education system becomes a big part of nation states. Often things like military service are really big. All the young men are going to have a shared institutional experience for 2-3 years, which will extend the shared schooling experience before it, and it'll make them one kind of thing. And French people are all the same, and British people are all the same as each other, and Germans, Americans, and so on. And of course, the US, United States version of it is a little bit different, a lot different from the European version, because Americans are not appealing to some primeval ancestors. Like the British will look back at King Arthur or Brute the Trojan, or one of these mythical figures, all these figures in the very distant past. Americans say, we white Americans came here recently and we have made this conscious decision to pool our very disparate identities into one unified identity. That's why we're all going to speak English and go through the schooling system and all the other things we do to become American. But this is really, really weird historically. Up till the late 18th century and way beyond that in most parts of the world, the normal thing has been a kind of multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural empire. Say like a classic case, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Europe. It's got this Habsburg ruling family, but the subjects of the empire, some of them think of themselves as Czechs, some as Poles, some as Ruthenians, some as Serbs, some as Croats. Yeah, they've got a little bit of everything going on in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And for centuries and centuries, that's been fine. I mean, yeah, who cares if your rulers don't speak your language? You're never going to meet them. They're never going to come around for tea or something with you. Doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is whether your rulers have been appointed over you by God. And as long as they can sell that idea reasonably well to you, and as long as the churches will go along with that idea and keep telling you, yeah, you may not like the Archduke, but God gave him to us, then these systems can work. They start coming to pieces in the late 18th century. And often the French Revolution is what we tend to point out. The French Revolution and the American Revolution too. It's the moments when the old multi-ethnic empires, they just don't match well enough with the way people live their lives anymore. So there's nothing sacred about these nation states. We've lived in them for a couple of centuries now. 2 centuries from now, I think it'll be very surprising if there's still a lot of nation states left in the world.
Mm. You mean it could go back to lots of small municipalities where the mayor is the most powerful person around? I call that fixing the pothole problems, right? Just solving little problems here and there for your immediate neighborhood. That's what I care about. I don't care what they're doing in Washington, okay? Something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, in a way, this is what a lot of the arguments about the European Union have been about. So, the EU, the ideas of European unification have been around for a long time. And you can say that characters like Napoleon and Hitler, that's sort of what they were trying to do, except they were doing it by violence, to unify Europe into a single political unit. 1945, though, marks a huge break, as it does in so many things. And you get the first really serious practical ideas getting floated in the late 40s for how to make a larger European kind of superstate, or United States of Europe, people often call it at the time, without using violence to force people to submit to a centralized government. And so this idea gets floated because after the horrors of World War II, any European who's got a grip on reality is going to say, we cannot go back there. We have to do something to prevent that sort of violence between these ethnic communities. Merging our sovereignty into a large European community, this is the way to go. And I think a lot of the resistance to that in the last 20 years has come from a growing sense that maybe that, in fact, isn't the way to go, rightly or wrongly. A lot of people are starting to say, well, giving up our Frenchness or our Britishness to a broader Europeanness, which most of us actually don't really feel, that is just a mistake. That sure, maybe, and even Nigel Farage, the leader of the UK Independence Party, in some ways the driving force behind the Brexit movement, even Farage was willing to say, yeah, there are things the EU has delivered. I mean, it has delivered on rising prosperity, has delivered on more peace between the old European nations. But those are not the most important things in life. Identity matters more. Mobility matters a lot. We are willing to give up a certain amount of GDP if we can have Britain for the British. And of course, Farage's arguments, this is not unique to Britain by any means. And any American listener, I mean, you've got to be half asleep if you don't see certain parallels between the British debates in the 2010s and what was happening in the US in the 2010s as well. So this is a very widespread kind of movement. And I mean, it's sort of the similarities between Europe and North America are kind of striking, but of course, so are the differences. That because of Europe's separate nation states history, the nation states provides this vehicle to have this discussion through. Whereas in the US, you don't have that. The idea of Texas or California or New York becoming an independent nation, that's kind of weird in America. And yet the same sort of identity forces dividing these regions, they're just as much there as they are in Europe. So it has to take a different format. And it's kind of, I just find it fascinating seeing the similarities and differences between the two parts of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, at the end of the moral arc, I speculated about like the return of the city state. That was a good idea. Let's go back to that.
Yes.
But then, and then maybe the nation state is going to persevere because of the so-called security dilemma, the Hobbesian trap, the other guy problem. If we break up as a power, that other guy over there is he's got nuclear weapons and he's got a huge nation state. So we have to maintain our nation state. We can't break up California and Texas and all that stuff. We can't let that happen. We need the money. We need the taxes, support this massive military. And we can't give up our nuclear weapons. And I don't know how we get to nuclear zero because of this problem, even though reducing it by 90% is a good start. So even if we have less than 10,000, what is it now, maybe 7,500 nuclear weapons, that's still enough to cause, if not the extinction of the species, a lot of misery, right? So how do you get to below 1,000 or below 100
Yes.
That still can act as a deterrent, but you're never going to get to zero. But a deterrent to what? Another nation state. Because if you have a little city state, who can afford nuclear weapons, right? But how do you get there?
Yeah, no, that's always been one of the great problems. I mean, one way to look at European history over the last 1,000 years is there's this tension between organizations that are very good at organizing capital and knowledge, which are cities basically, and then larger organizations which are very good at organizing violence, which is the kingdoms and empires. And each needed the other. That if you are the king of France or whatever, you need a lot of money. And the fastest way to get money is by taxing these cities. And the cities have only got money if you leave them free enough to engage in trade and do all the other things they want to do. But the cities, of course, are very vulnerable to other people coming and robbing them. So the cities need the kings to protect them. So they have this kind of slightly sick relationship between the two, each giving the other enough of what the other wants that the other can do its job, but not so much that the other one can actually come in and stomp all over it. And there are some futurists who do think that is kind of the direction that the world is going to go, and they talk about this sort of new medievalism, that we're going to have this balance between the big muscular nations and the little independent cities, and the 19th, 20th century nation state version of the world is going to have to be reconfigured. And actually, in the wake of Brexit, there was a poll that got, I forget how many signatures now, but tens of thousands of signatures asking the mayor of London to declare London independent and join the European Union, which turned out was sort of slightly illegal for a number of reasons. But a lot of people think this might not be such a bad thing.
Right. Well, so that brings us to your book, Geography is Destiny. I almost felt reading this like you were Alex Haley and this is Roots, right? Because you're from there, and it's almost like you're going back. How did I get to be who I am? Well, let's go back 10,000 years. Okay. Right. So you have this rise of the sea levels after the last ice age with the warming of the earth. So you have the English Channel. I think a lot of people don't even think about that. You mean England was not an island nation. It was just part of Europe. 8,000 years ago. So let's start there.
Well, so I decided to write this book actually the day after the Brexit vote, but like a lot of my sort of people, overeducated people who sort of travel around a lot. I was kind of shocked and appalled by the Brexit vote. What could possibly make people think this was a good idea? But I had actually been thinking about writing a book like this for some time. And the title of the book, Geography is Destiny, this is very much what the book is about. That we were talking at the beginning today about how I'd morphed from being a historian of a particular time and place, the ancient Greek world, into going into global history. And this involved scaling up the questions that I was asking. But after I've been working on these global questions for a while, it's hard to avoid realizing at a certain point that this is all very well. These global theories are all very well, but history is, of course, made by actual people in the here and now, living actual lives. And so, if your global level theories can't explain what goes on in a specific time and place, they're not really very much use to anything. So I've been thinking I should try to write a book that scales back down from the global to a more regional level, seeing how the grand scale theories work at explaining specific things that really happen. And initially, I was thinking I would write this book about ancient Greece, since that's what I'm supposed to know something about. But then the Brexit vote came along, and I realised, oh, well, this is a much more interesting test case here, the British Isles. And we've got this specific decision that gets made. Can long-term history help us understand this specific decision? And obviously, I come to the conclusion, yes, otherwise I wouldn't have written the book. But what I came to realize writing that book, it made me understand a lot better what people on the other side of the argument were thinking. That Brexit wasn't this weird, I mean, like we were talking about Putin and Ukraine, wasn't this weird anomaly that just pops out of nowhere. It's part of a much, much longer geostrategic debate going on among the British. And it's a geostrategic debate that is basically created by the fact that the British Isles are islands. And you can say geography is destiny, talking about absolutely any part of the world. And I've given talks based on the same ideas as I use in my book about Britain, given them in Nepal, all sorts of other countries have wildly different geography, but the basic principles are the same, understanding how geography forces these questions and issues onto people. And the big conclusion I guess I've come to about this is that geography drives history, but at the same time, history drives what geography means. And so like, geography determines whether you go down the path toward becoming democratic, industrialized kind of nation state, or whether you go down a path toward being a larger empire. But as you go down these paths, the meaning of the geography changes. And in the British case, the rising sea levels turning what had just been a kind of broad British plain extending out into the Atlantic Ocean off the body of Europe, while the Ice Age made the sea levels like 100 meters lower. Once the sea levels rise and cut off the islands, their geography is now going to be different, of course, from mainland continental powers. But what that geography has meant over the 8,000 years since the sea levels rose, it's gone through three broad phases. And the longest of them, the first phase, lasts for 7.5 out of the 8,000 years. And during those 7,500 years, the insularity of the British Isles doesn't actually matter all that much, because the kind of technology you're dealing with, the kinds of organization you've got, means that there is no way for anybody to close the English Channel. The English Channel is a highway, not a barrier. Anyone who can get to the French or Belgian side of the Channel can, unless they're unlucky, they can get to the English side of the Channel as well. So that barrier, that link to the continent is always open, constant back and forth. British history for 7,500 years is not that different from the history of peoples living on continental Europe. The only real difference is that the centers of wealth and power are way off to the south and east in the Mediterranean world, the Middle East, China. Britain is like the last place in Europe that everything comes to. Everything rolls downhill from the centers of wealth and power in the south and east. Britain is like Europe's poor cousin, the sort of worst, poorest, weakest place where everything ends up finally. But it ends up is what happens, because the Atlantic Ocean, the English Channel is a highway, not a barrier, but the Atlantic is a barrier, not a highway. It's basically, for all practical purposes, uncrossable. And that's what makes Britain the edge of the world. And what jumps British history out of this long, long pattern of being Europe's poor cousin into something completely different is that people learn to cross the Atlantic, basically. You get a technological and organizational revolution roughly 500 years ago. Invention of ships that can stay at sea for long periods, can cross the Atlantic Ocean reasonably safely. All of a sudden, Britain is not the edge of the world anymore. But those same ships, if you put them in the English Channel, as long as you've got an organization, a government that can raise enough money to build enough of them, to keep them at sea long enough, the ships that open the oceans can also close the English Channel. So all of a sudden, if the British want this to happen, insularity can trump proximity. Britain can be taken out of Europe, basically. And the British, after intense internal debate, much bloodshed, this is what the British do, starting around about 1600. They take the British Isles out of Europe. They turn the Channel into what Shakespeare called a moat defensive. And I think it's no accident that Shakespeare is the first English poet to start using this kind of language, as Britain as this sceptred isle, the sea as the moat defensive, because it just didn't make any sense 100 years earlier or 200 years earlier. So British come out of Europe. England is able to unite the whole of the British Isles into a single kingdom and project power over the oceans, create a global empire on which the sun never sets. Of course, there's a bit more to it than that. But this is basically what's driving it, is the new meaning of geography driven by new kinds of technology and organization. And then the third phase, of course, is much more recent, really since about 1900. Same forces keep operating, the world keeps shrinking, technology keeps devouring distance, organizations get bigger and bigger and bigger, and all of a sudden Britain gets pushed from being the central player on this Atlantic stage to being a kind of marginal player on a global stage, and the United States emerges as the great global player, and China is now catching up fast. And I think once you understand that, everything else about British history falls into place. The debate over EU membership, all kinds of stuff just starts to make a whole lot more sense once you understand this big geographical picture. And I think it also gives you some clues about where things might be going next.
Right. So those ships enable trade to happen, and therefore wealth and prosperity to increase, which increases political power and reach. And then so to what extent does Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and the rise of a science of economics and the debunking of mercantilism play a role? That is, before that, a nation would just accumulate as much gold and silver and stuff, so they have more stuff than the French, say, or the French have, more than the British. And there was that kind of win-lose, zero-sum game that Smith showed, and then other British economists. Well, that's not how you grow the wealth of a nation. Actually, we can get even wealthier if we trade with the French. So, but there's still that tension of, but we're different from the French. And, is it a barrier? Is it a trade route? What's the tension there over those centuries?
Yeah, I think it's no accident that the guy who grasped the basic principles of economics was British. Well, saying the guy, that's an exaggeration, because Smith is part of a group of thinkers, the late 18th century, who are all rethinking the principles of how wealth is generated and how the economy really works. And Scotland is the absolute center of this new thinking. So it's no accident that this is where it's happening, because the empire that the British are able to create, once they can close off the channel, keep the European powers at bay, and concentrate on, the way they described it at the time is engrossing the trade of the world. The British are the ones able to do this. The British are the ones who, more than anybody else, have to confront the intellectual challenges that this creates. And so Smith and Ricardo and a number of other thinkers start to realize, oh, yes, of course, it's not that the wealth that we can generate doesn't primarily come to us just from putting taxes on people, which is the way that the mercantilists tended to think about it. You make the biggest possible empire, you order your colonists to trade only with you, you tax the trade at both ends, you make all this money off it. Sure, that makes a lot of money, but we can make so much more money if we just create the biggest conceivable possible market, leave people free to truck and barter as they like. They will find out all the ways to increase wealth and prosperity. And then the state skims off from that. Another new idea, basically as little as it needs. The goal should not be to get as much money for the state as possible. The goal should be to take as little as is consistent with being able to provide the security framework which will allow a market to function properly. That's the only job a state should really have, is keeping the peace, allowing people to truck and barter freely. And at the time, Smith famously publishes his first volume in 1776, the year the American colonists rebel. And a lot of people in Britain are saying, oh my God, this is the end of the world. And Pitt the Elder says, oh, if the Americans succeed, all the gentlemen in England will leave tomorrow. They're going to get up and go to America and live there because Britain is going to go bankrupt now, which, of course, famously does not happen. And by 1789, British trade with America has already risen back above where it had been in 1776. It just keeps going up and up and up. Because, of course, what Smith saw that a lot of politicians had not grasped was that Americans are not trading with Britain just because the British are passing laws saying you have to trade with Britain. They're trading with Britain because that is where they can get the goods they need at the lowest prices, and where the trade routes are most secure and the most reliable and capital can be raised. This is why all this is happening. And so if you take away all the silly rules, then everybody can get on with this. And so long as the British can keep supplying the highest quality goods at the lowest prices, the wealth will just go up and up and up. And this, it's a counterintuitive idea. It's a difficult one to wrap your head around. I mean, like the other big idea of the time, David Ricardo's idea about comparative advantage, that it doesn't matter whether you are better at agriculture than the French. Even if French wheat is more expensive than British wheat, it often makes sense to buy the French wheat anyway, because we may be better than the French at growing wheat, but we're much better at the French at doing things like insurance and shipping and so on. And so we need to put all of the available capital into insurance and shipping, neglect agriculture, because we can always buy the wheat from the French. It costs more than we would spend to produce our own, but we can make even more money by using that investment more wisely. So all these counterintuitive ideas are coming up, and it's really difficult to sell governments on them. It's not till the 1840s that the British government repeals the Corn Laws, which are these protectionist laws promoting British agriculture, forbidding people from buying foreign grain. Ridiculous ideas, it now seems. But at the time, everybody thought, yes, of course, this is the way to go. So it took profound intellectual revolutions to kind of rejig the world to fit with the new realities that were emerging. And I think this is a lesson for our own times, of course. It's very difficult for us, I think, to accept some of the weird counterintuitive things that some people are telling us we now need to be doing.
Yeah, that's, again, back to Putin. If he wants stuff in Ukraine, he could just buy it. A lot cheaper, as it turns out, than money's going to spend on this idiotic war. And that's, almost always been the case. It's cheaper to just trade with another country rather than take their stuff through violence. And yet we're using economic sanctions to try to keep him and others like North Korea and Cuba and Iran or whatever in check from becoming too powerful. So there is that tension there. I want to ask you about the history of slavery and colonialism. Now it's pretty common to be very critical of the West for how they treated other peoples and got wealthy on it. And as you know, there are arguments for reparations. You owe these people because you exploited them centuries ago. And yet England was on the cutting edge of the abolition of the slave trade. They were the first in the Western countries to do this and outlaw it. And, then it took us, another half century to get there, and a war and so on. And colonialism, yes, okay. It's mostly bad, I guess. But is there anything good to be said about colonialism and what that did to enrich the British Isles? And what do the British Isles owe these people? And, how do you think about those issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the British role in the abolition of slavery is one of these things that looks very strange in certain ways, because the British, the British didn't invent slavery by any means, but they were the ones in the 18th century who really profited more than anybody from the Atlantic slave trade. And one of the main reasons that Britain kept going to war with Spain in the 18th century was to get permission to take part in the slave trade to the Spanish colonies in the New World. There's so much money to be made out of this. And so it does look rather peculiar that Britain is the first country to have a really powerful abolitionist movement and takes the lead in shutting down the Atlantic slave trade and then banning slavery altogether. But again, it's one of these things where in certain ways it looks weird, and yet it makes complete sense in other ways. We were talking a moment ago about Adam Smith and the sort of counterintuitive nature of the new ideas about economics that he and the thinkers around him were coming up with. And getting rid of slavery, though, it's very much part of the same new way of thinking about the world. I mean, if you believe Smith's line about the source of the wealth of nations being making the market as big as possible, allowing the division of labor to develop as finely as possible, which you do through taking away the regulations and leaving individuals free to truck and barter, then the worst thing you can possibly do is have slaves. I mean, that is the ultimate way of preventing people from being free to truck and barter. So, of course, if you're a Smithian, of course you want to abolish slavery. And I mean, it's not like a one-to-one thing that all of the abolitionists, Wilberforce and all these guys were hardcore Smithians. They weren't. But these ideas are like starting to bubble up in Britain and infect all these different ways of thinking. And it's all connected to this new thing, Britain's new position in the world, forced on it by the new meanings of geography. Britain has gone from being, say, in the 15th century, Britain is a second-rate player on a European stage. Now it's carved itself off from that stage and become the lead player on a global stage. And the Smithian kind of way of thinking about the world is one that is kind of suited to that new world order. So getting rid of slavery, this becomes a big British thing because it makes such tremendous sense for the British. And the cynical way of looking at it, which a lot of people do look at it this way, is that the British become the prime movers in abolitionism because the British development of capitalist industrialized labour is based on the freedom of labour in Britain and paying wages to attract labour. And the cynical way of looking at this is say, well, slavery undercuts British free labour. That if you are running factories, say, in the southern part of the United States, you're in Baltimore, say, and you can have slave labourers in your factory, well, that's going to undercut free labour in Britain. So the British are opposed to it for that reason. I think that's a rather naive way of looking at it, overly cynical way of looking at it. But it's the new thinking affects absolutely everything. And the British were quite right, and the critics of slavery were quite right, that you're never going to be able to make slave workers as efficient in an industrialized setting as free workers are going to be. You're never going to be able to incentivize them properly. It's, again, going back to Ukraine, it's a bit like the contrast between Russian troops and Ukrainian troops. Ukrainians have got something to fight for. Russians, a lot of them didn't even know they were going to war until they crossed the Ukrainian border. So there's a lot of reasons why Britain would turn against the slave trade, having been formerly the power most committed to doing it.
Yeah. Yes, and of course it's good to remember there were other countries in the slave trade, like the Arab slave trade, in which the ships with slaves went in the other direction. I don't know that much about that because we don't learn about that here in America, just the American slave trade. I do wonder, there was this argument that we didn't need to fight the Civil War, that slavery would have fallen into economic disuse here in the United States by, say, the 1870s or 80s, maybe. It's okay if your dog barks. I have a dog that barks periodically here too. No, it's all right. Yeah. Anyway, that there are some people who argue we didn't need to fight the Civil War. It would have fallen into economic disuse. But the counter argument is that the technology made slavery more efficient here, with the cotton gin, for example, and therefore it could have lasted until the 1890s or even the 1900s. Sorry, early 1900s and so on. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I find any kind of counterfactual arguments like this just endlessly fascinating. And I think this you can't explain anything. You can't ask any causal questions about the past unless you're willing to raise counterfactual scenarios. But they're very, very difficult to resolve. I mean, it is always difficult to say, well, how would we know what would have happened if something else had happened? And so with US slavery, I think the big argument for saying it would have gone away anyway is just to ask yourself, can you imagine a United States in which we still had 1/3 of the population of the southern states in chattel slavery? I mean, it is absolutely unimaginable. And countries like Brazil, and Brazil was the last big country to make slavery illegal in 1888. Within a quarter of a century of the American Civil War, slavery had been banned, at least legally banned, in almost the whole world except for certain parts of the Muslim world. So it's really hard to imagine that American slavery would have gone on indefinitely if not for the Civil War. But the other side of it is the other side of this argument is to say, well, of course, you have to think about what the sort of the second order counterfactuals are. If you take away one thing and say it didn't happen, then you're going to get this cascade effects of other things that don't happen. So, like the Civil War. US Civil War doesn't just end American slavery. It is the biggest thing that has ever happened in the history of slavery. Everybody else in the world sees this. Would Brazil have got rid of slavery by 1888 had it not been for the American Civil War? Quite possibly not. I mean, my guess, you can only guess about these things. My guess is that slavery would have gone away, just as serfdom in the Russian Empire was in the process of going away at just the same time. slavery would have gone away because the forces encouraging a shift toward free labor were just so enormous. I find it impossible to imagine slavery of the form you had in, say, in 1850 in Virginia. Impossible to imagine that persisting. But what I find very easy to imagine persisting is what actually does persist, which is Jim Crow type situations, where you've got sharecropping and all these other ways of having really slavery by another name. And, obviously in Jim Crow South, it's not the same as the pre-Civil War South by any means. Jim Crow is not as horrendous as slavery, but it's still pretty horrendous. So my guess would be you would have got a much more gradual transition. You might have had less incentive to get rid of the Jim Crow laws even in the 1960s, and this might have dragged on much, much longer. But certainly slavery of the form that existed before the Civil War, that probably would have gone away by itself.
Interesting. Yes, in the 1990s, I wrote an essay kind of applying chaos theory to counterfactual history, looking at the Battle of Antietam-Sharpsburg. General Lee, one of his underlings, found. Sorry, you dropped out of there for a second.
So I had to deal with the dogs again for a second.
Just before Antietam-Sharpsburg battle, which was kind of crucial for determining whether the South was going to be considered as an independent nation and recognized by Britain as an independent nation that we can trade with, and had the North won that battle, that probably would have changed the direction of the war quite a bit. But General Lee got McClellan's plans because one of his soldiers dropped the plans, and so Lee knew what he was going to do, and so on. Anyway, it's one of these kind of, right there at that day, that's when things change. Of course, we don't know for sure. This brings up this idea of the role of ideas. So one of the ideas in the West is that people should be treated equally. They should have equal rights. And, this took centuries to, percolate down, to everybody. But we're here. And so how do you think about the role of ideas in history of civilization? And that although the West has a lot of blood on its hands and, we have sinned, but on the other hand, without those ideas, maybe the slave trade would have continued on regardless of economics. So it's not just economics, but that, Western ideas about equal rights, it is a powerful force in history. And it doesn't matter what race you are, you could apply it to everybody or gender or anything.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I am, if you read even a couple of pages of one of my books, you'll see right away I'm very much a materialist. So I don't ever apologize for thinking material forces are driving the ideas. But this new idea about equality and the idea that you should treat everybody the same, everybody should have freedom to pursue the sorts of lives they want. It is a very new idea, and there's versions of it going back many centuries, but the sort of full package has never been anything like the kind of democratic ideas that now dominate large parts of the world, and particularly the Western world. And these have grown up very, very quickly in the last 250 years. And there's no way around the basic fact that these are initially Western ideas, Western Europe, Western European colonists overseas like North America, and then in various versions, to various degrees, they've spread outward from there. But it also seems to me that the reason they get invented in those particular parts of the world is that these are the parts of the world that in the 18th century are going through this energy revolution. People are finding all kinds of new ways through trade, all kinds of new ways to bring together the goods of the world, deal with them in markets. Then they crack the secret of fossil fuels, unleashes this energy bonanza in the 19th century. And this creates all sorts of new questions that people have never had to face before. Like what is the optimal organization for a society that is suddenly awash in the energy provided by steam engines? And humans have free will. Nothing is dictated to us. So these things get worked out by evolutionary processes. So all of these ideas, they're like your random mutations in biology. All of these ideas bubble up. And then it's up to us to find out what works best. And one of the big ideas that starts to get traction in the 19th century in Britain and other countries moving toward willing to move toward a liberal political democracy, is this idea that the most effective way to organize a society is going to be by opening everything up, treating everybody as being the same, and it gradually spreads out. First of all, it's okay, middle-class men will be treated as being the same as upper-class men. And then it's, middle-class Christian men. Then, okay, well, we'll let the Jews be part of this as well. And then, should we let women be part of this? And should we let the working class? On and on. It goes outward and outward. And generally, what people in Western countries find is that the more you take away the old barriers that worked so well for thousands of years for the rulers of agrarian empires, the more you take those away, the better things go. The richer the country as a whole gets, the richer the elite gets as well. The more invention there is, it's just fantastic. But there are other ideas out there. And so, like, say, in the 20th century, in Germany, in the Soviet Union, you get these totalitarian alternatives that, like the liberal democracies, what they're saying is modern fossil fuel countries are going to work best if everybody within them is kind of all the same. Everybody agrees on that. They should be nation states, so everybody should be Russian or German or American or what. Everybody agrees on that. What they disagree on is how do you get them to be the same? And the liberal solution is, well, you have certain institutions that are a bit coercive, like schooling, national language, national service, these sorts of things. But basically, you get everybody to be the same by saying the differences don't matter. And so if you want to go to a synagogue and I want to go to a Catholic church, well, that's fine, because it doesn't matter. We can be governed by the same laws. We can do business with each other. That's what matters. This other stuff, that's just personal preference. If you're a woman and I'm a man, it doesn't matter. Women can go in the workforce. None of this stuff really matters. We can sort of all work together. Nazis and the communists in the Soviet Union say, no, the way you get people to be all the same is by eliminating the differences. And so with the Nazis, of course, the thing they worry about most is ethnic, racial differences. You get rid of those by eliminating the Jews, above all. The Soviets, of course, it's class differences. You get rid of those by eliminating the kulaks and other undesirable class elements. So it's two visions of a modern fossil fuel state that share certain things, like the idea of homogeneity of the citizen body, but disagree wildly on how you get there. And in the 20th century, the liberal democratic version won. And it won not because it was more attractive, but because it worked better. That it beat the totalitarians on their own territory, which was mustering violence. And the Allies win the Second World War, although, of course, it depends very much on Soviet participation. But the Allies win the Second World War by mustering violence more efficiently than the Germans. And opinions differ on why the US won the Cold War. But I tend to think that the people who say the US won the Cold War primarily because it was so much better at organizing its potential for violence than the Soviets. That's why we won. It was the new arms race that really undid the Soviet Union. But obviously, opinions vary on that. So these ideas matter enormously. But I would say the ideas are ultimately determined to a great degree by the economic, geographical substructure of society, but then it has to be worked out in practice. So you can say Western liberal ideas were a better fit for the New World than the totalitarian ideas. That didn't mean that they had to win, though. They could still have lost. They could still have lost the Second World War.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I mentioned it's pretty common on college campuses now to hear, the decolonization of X, which is almost everything now. And it's and the idea of colonialism is just hammered. And yet you still have a few people that say, well, hang on, maybe one cheer for colonialism, maybe two cheers for colonialism. I won't go to three cheers, but two cheers. Because at least the British brought law and order to India, and the idea of property rights, and they built railroads and this and that. And no, we wouldn't do that again. But it's not all bad, because at least the certain principles of Western economics and political systems is good, and that we should do that. And yet here, America's just finished up with two 20-year wars in which we failed to bring democracy and trade and Western values to Iraq and Afghanistan. If the ideas are so good, why did they have this dark side to it, which is part of history? And why don't other people want to adopt those.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, colonialism, like, excuse me. So there are a lot of good things about being able to do these things by Zoom from home, but
Yes,
some practical difficulties too.
I know.
But no, I mean, colonialism, like anything else in the whole of history that you look at, everything that's ever happened has had upsides and downsides. Everything is a mix of the good and the bad. I mean, sometimes it's overwhelmingly clear that either good or bad is the dominant thing here. But colonialism, I mean, it would be astonishing if there were nothing positive at all that had come out of the 19th century colonial movement. And so one of the things political scientists like to do is compare the fates of different parts of the world, divided up by which Western power colonized them. And there are certain things that have gone better for former British colonies than for former French or former German colonies. Certain things have gone worse as well. So it would be astonishing if that were not the case. But also, I think the counterfactual argument comes in again. It's like, okay, if you were to say there was no colonial, the British didn't create their empire, what do you think was going to happen? Do you think that everybody in Nigeria would have been just left to sort of go along in their way, doing whatever it was they were doing in the Niger Delta? Well, no, of course they weren't. The French were going to show up and take them over. If you're going to try to wish away the colonial heritage, you have to reimagine the entirety of world history. I mean, it seems to me that once the Industrial Revolution happened in Western Europe, there was no way that colonial regimes were not going to be created across a large part of the rest of the planet. This was just as inevitable as anything can ever get. And the sort of cynical history of colonialism, which a lot of historians, particularly the British Empire, as a move toward in the later 20th century, was that the British government had almost no interest in taking over colonies overseas. It consistently fought against colonialism because colonialism just brought more expense and more danger for British governments. And so it tended to be the people on the ground, the British guys on the ground, who were the big ones pushing colonial takeovers. And they did this because it was a way for them to profit and be powerful. And so long as that was the case, then colonial empires expanded and expanded. The minute that ceased to be the case in the early to mid 20th century, they start imploding. The British were seriously talking about getting out of India right after World War One. The British Empire developed in the way that it did because it was good for a lot of the people running the British Empire to see it grow, and British politicians back home found ways to make it work reasonably well for the central government as well. And British Empire came apart when those factors ceased to apply. So I think while it's all very well to condemn colonialism, I think that is more of a way of advertising your own moral superiority than a serious discussion of world history, because it's just not possible to imagine a world in which this didn't happen.
Yeah, that's certainly a, geography is destiny materialist argument. If it was the British, it would have been somebody else because there's certain forces that are just kind of unfolding. And if you don't have an opinion on this, this is okay. But are there any arguments for reparations that the British owe their colonial peoples, or more currently that the American government owes to African Americans, or for that matter, Native Americans? Or should we just draw the line here, clean the slate? History has good and bad things, and we just want to make society as fair as possible for everybody.
Yeah, I guess I would say this is a sort of moral and political argument rather than a historical argument. That I know people who take very, very different views on this as a political question, but who more or less agree on the sort of historical facts of what happened. So I would say that's a question more about whether you think paying reparations now, what you think paying reparations now would actually do. And I don't know. I guess I tend to be on the conservative end of this. I would want to be persuaded that, well, I would want to see a better case for what it will actually do, what it will do for society to do this. Because I don't think there's no way to undo what's been done in the past. Whether you pay reparations or not makes no difference to the cruelty and misery that happened back in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I guess I'm still waiting to see a clearer case for why paying reparations now would, in fact, improve everybody's well-being in the 21st century.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that, although I could imagine the government not sending everybody a check, which clearly they're capable of doing. Like during the pandemic, everybody got a payroll protection plan check and so forth. But I think that would be a mistake. But I could see like tax breaks, something like the GI Bill after World War II. We want our population to be educated. These guys serve their country. They get free college. You could do something like that for African Americans and Native Americans and anybody else, I suppose, that would count as having suffered something. As I read it, it seems to be an argument for not just leveling the playing field or righting the wrongs of the past, but closing the gaps between, say, black and white incomes, household wealth, generational wealth, educational levels, and so forth. That seems to be the drive behind it. We're behind and we need to catch up. And everybody goes, yeah, of course, we want you to. Yes. Okay, how do you do that, right? So something like tax breaks for college, or erasing of student loans, or I don't know what, something like that. I mean, the government already does this. I always make this point. I get a tax break for being married, and I have a kid, so I get another tax break for that. So apparently, the government wants me to be married and wants me to have kids, right? And I get to deduct the interest on the mortgage in the house I'm sitting in. So I guess they want me to be a homeowner. So the government is already in the business of nudging things along through these kind of tax motivation systems. So I could see something like that, I suppose. That would be better than just sending everybody a check. But that general idea that you have, I think I agree with you that, history's already happened. We can't change that, and it happened for certain reasons, and we need to understand that. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that. Back to your book, just kind of bring this, full circle here. You back to those 5 characteristics of identity, mobility, prosperity, security, and sovereignty. Going forward, let's say in the next 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, will there be a British culture or people, an American people, a French, German, and so on? Not necessarily a nation state, since we talked about that, but something like a cultural, character, something like that.
Yeah, well, going forward 1,000 years, it's very hard to say. I suspect not. I suspect that not much that we recognize now will still be recognizable in 1,000 years. One of the things that struck me writing this book, I started off looking at the arguments that people have been making during the Brexit debates in the mid-2010s in Britain. And this was when I sort of came down on these 5 forces of identity, mobility, prosperity, security, and sovereignty, that the arguments all seem to revolve around these 5 factors. And the more I thought about the historical patterns, it seemed to me that the arguments had always revolved around these 5 factors. You can go all the way back to Tacitus, who wrote about the Roman conquest of Britain 2,000 years ago. And in Tacitus's Agricola, you get people talking about these exact same 5 factors, often in rather similar ways to how they were talking in the 2010s, which was kind of amusing. And then so think about more broadly about the world. Well, these are the 5 factors that people talk about everywhere. And I realized that the reason for this is that these are, in fact, not the 5 forces that are really driving the story. It's the changing meanings of geography are driving the story along. But these 5 forces, identity, mobility, prosperity, security, sovereignty, this is how we experience the forces of geography in our daily lives. And so you don't wake up in the morning thinking, oh my God, I'm terrified that faster internet is going to effectively shrink the Pacific Ocean and change the geostrategic balance. I mean, very few of us wake up worrying about that. We worry about much more sort of concrete things like, oh, okay, Chinese textiles are undercutting the ones made in the factory where I work. I'm going to lose my job. We worry about stuff like that. Migration flows, maybe, oh, this is going to change the world that I grew up with. I'm not comfortable about this. These are how the vast impersonal forces of geography get manifested in our everyday lives. I think it makes complete sense that these are the things that politicians talk about, these 5 forces, because that's what most of us worry about most of the time. But it also means that these five forces are constantly changing as technology, organization transform what geography means. And so, like, the way most Americans feel about identity and mobility and so on now is quite different from the way most Americans felt, say, 50 years ago. And actually, at the moment, I'm reading a book about American politics in the late 1970s. And it is fascinating to see how similar some of the debates are, but how very, very different a lot of the assumptions were. And you go back another 50 years, the 1920s, it all felt very different again. I mean, in the 1920s, it was still reasonably plausible for Americans to think of geography as cutting them off from the world. That these two vast oceans make military threats from Europe or Asia just kind of comically implausible. It's just not going to happen. And of course, geography's changed its meaning so much now that the American history has become much less exceptional than it was a century ago. America is more like the rest of the world now, like it or not. That is the reality thing, because geography changes meaning so much. And American debates about identity and mobility and everything else have changed kind of in parallel with the shifts in the meaning of geography. So you ask, will there still be Britishness in 10, 100, 1,000 years' time? I won't be surprised if the United Kingdom breaks down. I mean, you've probably heard about the success of Sinn Féin in the Northern Irish elections, all kinds of reasons why Northern Ireland might want to gravitate toward the Republic, all kinds of reasons why Scotland might want to declare independence and join the European Union. Wales and England seem a bit more joined at the hip, but not inseparably so. I won't be surprised if 50 years from now there's no longer a United Kingdom. I think there will still be something distinctive about the insular identity of people in the British Isles at that point, just as there is now, even though the Republic of Ireland is independent. There's still something distinctly insular going on there. Going further forward, though, I think as space and geography continue to change their meanings, we should expect most of the values and ideas we currently hold to lose much or even all of their meaning over the next few hundred years. The sorts of things that we worry about, I think, really are going to seem as alien to people in 200 years' time as the everyday worries of a Neanderthal would to you or me. So I guess I'm a huge believer in radical change is bearing down on us faster than any of us realize.
Right. What about immigration? Because, like, one of the arguments, I think in the pre-Brexit, was that there's too many non-Western-like immigrant peoples changing the meaning of what it means to be British. And I'll just use a different example in Germany, because my wife's from Cologne, Germany. And, when Angela Merkel opened up the borders to all these Syrian immigrants and other countries who were mostly Muslim, it was like, well, they think of women differently than Germans do, or Westerners, let's say. They don't think women should be equal to men in many characteristics. And the attitude in Germany is like, well, then go home. That's not what we believe here. If you want to live here, you got to sign the guest book and agree. This is what you're going to go along with. This is our rules. Mm-hmm. And now that's kind of called cultural appropriation, or you're being, illiberal in your attitudes toward people that are different from you. And of course that, Trump used a lot of that in his rhetoric about, they're coming here, the Mexicans are coming here not just to take your jobs, but, they're bringing rapists and drug dealers and so on. And, that there's a lot of people that, bought into that. So how do you think about immigration in this context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think immigration has always been one, and emigration, of course, as well, one of the central planks in any discussions about identity and about the meaning of people's lives. And we're able to say a lot more about migration in the past than we used to be able to do, because one of the big revolutions in archaeology in the last 10 years has been the transformation of our ability to peer into ancient genomes. And so now we can actually put percentage figures on the scale of genetic changes at different points in the past. And when I started writing Geography is Destiny, and during the immediate aftermath of the Brexit debates, there was a lot of silly stuff being said in Britain by politicians, which not shocking, not unusual. A lot of silly stuff being said about migration by British politicians. And you were getting some on the right were saying, Polish plumbers was their sort of British equivalent of the Central American migrant caravans that got talked about here. Polish plumbers are taking over the country and stealing your jobs, and a lot of things being said about that. And then the other side, the other end on the left, you got a lot of people saying, well, really, what's been going on? It's not that different. There's always been migration into Britain. This is not that different. We could, if you look at it more sensibly, you can see that the answer, as so often, is somewhere in the middle. That in 2010's Britain, there was a higher percentage of foreign-born people than at any time since the 5th century AD, the highest in 1500 years. The scale of immigration after 2004, after the expansion of the European Union, really did jump up dramatically. So the question, I think, wasn't anything to do with the facts of immigration. The question was always about values, about, well, what feels right to you? Do you like the idea of a Britain or a USA that is constantly in flux and changing, is open to new things coming from the outside? Do you get excited about the thought that maybe what you grew up with is now disappearing and the world for your kids is going to just feel and look very, very different? Or does that alarm you? And that sort of argument about values and morals, this is something that has always been with us. And again, you look at Tacitus's writings about the Roman conquest of Britain, it's there already. There are some people who are excited about Britain being drawn into this sophisticated, cosmopolitan, wealthy Roman Empire, and there are others who are horrified at these decadent continentals coming with their effete bathing and perfumes and wine and all this other disgusting stuff. These are timeless arguments. And so, while I'd say the facts on the ground change dramatically from period to period, the arguments themselves don't change all that much, because it's an argument about your personal aesthetic, moral view of the world. What kind of world do you want to live in? I think that's what the immigration debate really comes down to.
Yeah, it does seem like there's back to that. What does it mean to be British or American, French or German? A kind of a fuzzy set of characteristics that this is how we define ourselves, and it's somewhat fluid. We can move and change and bring in some, and it gets nudged here and there. But I guess the fear is if too many immigrants come in that are too different, they really don't share our Western values of law and order and property rights and whatever, civil rights and whatnot, then that's going to change who we are. It reminds me of that bumper sticker back, I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s. Why the hell should I press 1 for English? English is our language. If you want to come here, you got to speak English, right? And, I live in Southern California. Well, you live in California, so the Spanish is very commonly spoken here. So what? And, so, I get the conservative argument about that. Yes, okay, there, preserve certain values. Yeah. But it seems to me like another conservative value is we cherish freedom, and people who are seeking freedom, we want to help them. We want to encourage them to embrace the kind of values we embrace as freedom. So when you saw that caravan of Central Americans coming heading for the Mexican-American border, and, Trump and his people were freaking out, and showing videos. Fox News showed the videos of, young men. Everybody else showed that, 90% of the people in the caravan were women and children. Shouldn't we be championing them? Like, look, they're like our ancestors who left Europe to come to America because they wanted freedom. And these people want freedom. They want prosperity. They want to come here and work. Why don't we support that? And, to me, conservatives are kind of stuck in this tension between those two values, right? I try to encourage them, nudge them in the direction of let's be more open to supporting these kind of people. And I don't know what the solution to this is. I don't think America can be the world's police, but don't we have a moral obligation to help people who are in repressive regimes? And
yeah, so of course you're talking to an immigrant here, so I tend to have strong personal views on this. But migration, it's a topic. Migration is a topic that historians sort of moved away from at one point because it became very associated with 19th century thinking and ideas about race, which became hugely unpopular among historians in the mid 20th century. But it is one of the most interesting and most important topics in history, I think. And we now know so much more about it than we used to do. And there are some big patterns visible. And like British archaeologists for a long time have been very interested in migration. There's been a lot of migration in and out of the British Isles through history. And one of the big distinctions they started making almost a century ago was between migrations that impose new outside cultures on the British Isles and then migrations where the people are absorbed within pre-existing British cultures. And of course, any particular migration is always a mix between the two and a bit of a balance. But certainly there are migrations that have catastrophic effects for the host population. And so in the British case, again, since this is what I've been writing about, that recent book, round about 2400 BC, there was a large migration into the British Isles from the continent. We've sort of known about that for a long time. We were aware that this happened. What we didn't know was the scale on which it happened, which has now been revealed by ancient DNA studies. And somewhere between 90 and 95% of the native DNA in Britain disappeared between 2400 and 2000 BC. Catastrophic immigration for the native population that can't have been anything except violent. So there's no way around the violent side of this. So disastrous things do happen because of immigration sometimes. And yet there's all these other occasions when immigration has had anything but a disastrous effect for the native population. And all kinds of variables are involved. And actually, one of the variables, since you brought up the subject of young men, they're a problem. Migrations that bring in a lot of young men, these are often really bad news for the locals. And as you say, in these Central American migrant caravans, and in Britain they talk about the Polish plumbers, but actually relatively few actual Polish plumbers came. The modern migrations, there have been so much more women and children in these migrations. These are a different sort of migration from the kind of thing you tended to see around the frontiers of the Roman Empire when the Vikings start coming to the British Isles. And I think one of the problems we get is that we operate in such broad brushstrokes. We just say migration like it's all the same thing. It really isn't. And the kind of immigration that the United States has generally seen has been very, very different from the kind of immigration that's often gone on in the past. And the kind of immigration that's been catastrophic for North America, for native populations, has been the kind that Europeans themselves brought to North America starting in the 16th century when they came and exterminated and drove off the native populations, which was overwhelmingly of Western European young men coming in and conquering things. So yeah, I think you do have to make these distinctions.
Yeah, that's important. Good. All right, Ian, we've been going over an hour and a half. Since I made the analogy with your book with Alex Haley's Roots, give us kind of a broad overview. Do you feel you understand yourself, your family, your people, or Western people better now after this book?
Yes. I mean, I got into writing this Geography is Destiny book because I wanted to see how well the grand global theories could be scaled down to talk about a particular part of the world. And I felt that I learned a lot from doing that. I learned a lot about the Brexit debate. I learned a lot about the sort of long-term attitudes of the British to Europeanness, and by extension, the long-term attitudes of people all over the world to joining larger political organizations, submerging their sovereignty and identity in something bigger. And I felt I did also learn quite a bit more about myself and about why I've turned into quite the peculiar person that I am. And I mean, as you say, Alex Haley and Roots, I had not really thought all that much about the geography of where I specifically came from within the British Isles. And one of the big divisions in Britain is geographical divisions, is between the low-lying, relatively fertile, relatively warm southeast, most of England, and then the northern and western parts, which are hillier, thinner soils, wetter, colder, and have had lower populations, been poorer, and been less politically organised throughout almost the whole of British history. And the town I come from, on Stoke-on-Trent, is just on the north and western side of the line dividing the two, but in what geographers call the Midland Gap, which is kind of a low-lying area running between two hilly areas. So it's kind of this mix of the soft southeast and the sort of more rugged north and west. And the very last part of the book, I describe a trip back to Stoke-on-Trent, my hometown, that I made in 2017, almost exactly a year after the referendum. And for me, that was just very, very revealing, thinking about the forces that had made me into the person who I am, and also the forces that have made my hometown into the particular kind of place that it is. So yeah, I think that's one of the great things about history, that if you don't learn more about yourself while you're doing history, then you're doing something wrong.
That's great. Fabulous. Good place to end. What's next on your big research agenda? I know you're always thinking about some huge topic to tackle in the next couple of years. What are you thinking about?
Well, the moment what I'm doing, although it's moving more slowly than I'd like, I'm writing a book which is kind of global ancient history. Because I think that one of the problems we've got is like you've got this huge scholarly institutional organization of historians working on particular times and places in tremendous detail, but sort of down these deep silos, knowing everything there is to know about, French production of motor cars in the late 1920s, or whatever your topic might be. And then you've got the historians who, a lot of them come from natural science backgrounds or are very heavily influenced by natural science backgrounds. They're interested in the big picture history. And the way they often tend to work is by thinking much more seriously about than normal historians do about initial conditions. So you'll specify the sort of initial beginning condition of the experiment that you're interested in. So like say with Jared Diamond, it was the end of the Ice Age, the beginning of agriculture. Think a lot about initial conditions, and then you jump forward to the present and explain what's happening in the world now on the basis of what you've just found out or shown about the initial conditions of the agricultural revolution or whatever it might be. And everything in between is like this sort of flyover zone. Like the whole of recorded history becomes kind of the historical Midwest. Everybody just sort of flies over it between the distant past and the present. And I think what has made my work a little bit different is that coming more from a historian and archaeologist background, I think you can only really answer the questions by telling a continuous narrative. You can't just jump from the beginning to the end. You've got to explain how you actually filled in the gap and all the things that happened along the way, which always mean that the initial conditions don't explain the whole of the outcome. And for that, the ancient world is absolutely crucial because this is the bulk of the story. And yet no one has ever seriously tried to put together the whole of the ancient world within a single coherent narrative. So in a way, it's kind of the anti-dawn of everything. It's like the Graeber and Wengrow book, but turned absolutely on its head. I will be attempting to do the exact opposite of what they were doing, which is basically to show that there is no real larger pattern here. There's just a question of how we accidentally stumbled into the world we currently have, where we're trapped within hierarchies and inequalities and so on. Whereas it seems to me the evolutionists actually have got it right, that there was a limited number of ways this could turn out. And the ancient world is where the world gets set down the path that leads to the present. And so we desperately need a global history of the ancient world. And luckily, here I am to write it.
That's great. Oh, man, I can't wait to read that because I just love all that stuff. And I want to
I can't wait to write
about
it
the
either.
origins of I want to talk to you about the origins of religion, which is a subject I'm eternally fascinated by, because that certainly plays a role. And now there's this Göbekli Tepe that goes back 11,000 years that was made by hunter-gatherers, and it appears to have been something like a religious temple. Whoa, what was going on there? What were they thinking? Maybe religion goes back even further, whatever the word would be. It's probably different from our form of religion, but yeah, that's super interesting, right? What do they call that? Path dependency. You start down a certain path, it's hard to get out of that particular path. So yeah, determining what happened then at the very beginning would be super important. All right, that we could spend another hour just talking about that, but let's save that for when your next book comes out. All right, Ian, thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate it. I appreciate your work.
Well, thanks so much for having me on the show. This has been a lot of fun.